Hey, and welcome back to your #1 source for cozy gaming and design content. I'm Nick, and today we're going to be taking a look at a cool thing that I found at a local Savers. This TI 1200 calculator. Okay, so I don't really have much use for a calculator these days, but there's something just so compelling about the design opportunities afforded by something so simple and yet so functional. Now, I don't think this particular design is the perfect or optimal design for a nice, chunky calculator. The buttons are a bit mushy, and I wish they had better feedback, but the overall design is just so up my alley, I couldn't help but pick it up when I saw it on the shelves. Let's start with the overall form factor. We can classify this pretty confidently as a rectilinear form. That's to say, it makes use of flat planes which meet at defined angles, with sharp edges, and lacks any substantial curvature. Now, the keen-eyed among you will notice that it does in fact bulge out a bit. This makes it the perfect example of how, while we can definitely broadly define the form of an object using words like rectilinear and curvilinear, and while they can be broadly useful for classification, they aren't mutually exclusive. Just because something is largely rectilinear doesn't mean it can't have curvature and some organic elements. In fact, I would argue that for most designs, when you mix the two, it's much more interesting and much more beautiful than designs that stick rigidly to one or the other. But back to our analysis. Like I said, this can generally be classified as a rectilinear form. And the main material used is this beautiful crackled ABS, which I believe is made possible during the casting process. It's got this beautifully retro color scheme going on with black, beige, and various analogous colors like gold, red, and orange. But this is all just textbook definitions and analysis. None of this actually tells us why I find this so compelling and interesting from a design standpoint. And that is a much more personal and much more difficult question to answer. I think a lot of what appeals to me about retro designs like this one comes from the inherent history that these objects possess. I know someone, and probably multiple people before me, used this to do their calculations. Who knows what numbers made their way through this object and onto a tax document or a piece of code somewhere? I don't know, and there's no way of knowing unless I somehow tracked down and interviewed the previous owners. And that's what's so interesting about these used objects to me. Finding something like this makes me feel kind of like Indiana Jones discovering some cool artifact, but, less problematic. It connects me to the past in a completely tangible way that you can't really get with products that are made to emulate retro styles. Take this record player, for example. Sure, it looks cool and fits my aesthetic, but ultimately, it's kind of just a prop. Yes, it can play records, but when I look at this, all I see is an implication of history and not an actual living artifact of that history. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think things like these necessarily have more inherent value than something that's made to emulate this style. In fact, from a functionality standpoint, I definitely think it could be argued that they have far less value. But to me, that's really not the point. Things like this help to break me out of that place that we can all get sometimes, where we, know that history happened, but we don't really internalize that those were actual real people like us, walking, talking, and feeling just like we do. And for me, designs like this, which are the culmination of countless hours of so many people's lives, show exactly that. And I think it's important to note here that while things like that reproduction record player aren't as interesting now, they will gain those same inherent properties as they age. The further you get from when something was made, the more interesting it becomes to look at and appreciate. So I'm not saying that this calculator is perfect or anything like that. There really are no objective properties about this calculator that make it more interesting than things made today, other than the fact that it wasn't made today. And I think it's the same reason why I like old books way more than new ones. It's not because the stories are better or more interesting. What am I going to do? Read? I just love looking at them and feeling them and experiencing the end result of so many hours of someone's life. And again, it helps connect me with the people in the past in a way that I couldn't possibly hope to do by reading facts about them in a textbook. Every little detail of this calculator was considered and designed with intention and care. There was probably countless iterations of this calculator before this was finally decided on. And when I hold something like this, I can just feel all those meetings and discussions the designers had trying to come up with the best calculator they could think of. Take this display, for example. The problem solving involved in creating this display is incredibly interesting to me. I don't really know if they had a technical reason why they couldn't simply have a large display right up against the glass, but for whatever reason, they decided to do a tiny little display and just magnify it with this brilliant little magnifying strip. That is exactly what I'm talking about when I say I love analog designs. It's not that I literally just prefer analog technology. I mean, you can imagine how long and frustrating just making this video would be if I had to do it the fully analog way, let alone trying to get it into your hands so you can watch it. No, I love the tactility of things like this, where they clearly had a problem to solve, that being that for whatever reason, they could only use a tiny little display. So they needed to find a way to make it more clearly readable. And they came up with this brilliant solution. Just slap some lenses over each number, and there you go, now you can read it. And that's not to say that this never happens today. It does. It's just to say that when you see that kind of thing in old products like this, at least for me, it's particularly compelling. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that they didn't have the technologies of today, which make all of the engineering and all of the advancements so much less obvious. They had to literally slap physical lenses, optical lenses on here in order to get the effect that they needed. That's not really a thing that we do a lot of times today. And I really appreciate being able to see all of those choices. And that's afforded by analog technologies. And I don't want to sound like too much of a boomer, but I do think that with the move to simple flat screens like those that are preferred by most tech these days, we do lose some of that personality that things like this have. And while it's certainly impressive and super interesting to learn about all the technological innovations that have been made over the years, I can't help but feel less connected and less cognizant about the people behind all of my favorite products that are made today. And I think a lot of that comes from the highly commercialized and proprietary nature of modern product design. And again, that's not to say that
back in the day, everything was open and honest.
Absolutely not. But when you look back at old technology like this, the technological limitations of the time made all the choices involved way more obvious. These days, the really impressive technological designs and innovations are done at such a small scale that you need an electron microscope and a PhD to understand what's going on. And that's only if you pass the security checks and get sworn to absolute secrecy on punishment of death, at least financial, not to tell anyone outside the company anything about how this thing works. I think it's important to take a step back here though. I'm not saying we should go back to this way of doing things, or that 50 years ago was definitively better than today. It was decidedly not, just that we should appreciate these little artifacts of history and use them to help ourselves understand better the product design process. There is a reason, after all, that people who want to learn to write generally have great success studying the classics. People who want to learn to code generally start by modifying older code and looking back to see how those previous coders solved fundamentally the same problems 50 years before them. And the same with art. We look back at the classics to understand and try to really grok how they did what they did. There is always something to learn from history. And while we definitely shouldn't look back with rose-colored glasses, we should also be ready to accept and embrace things that they did right. and incorporate those into our own designs. You don't always need to reinvent the wheel when you're making something new. Believe me, I know and fully understand the temptation to start from zero every time. But it's okay to let our predecessors' achievements influence and guide us to making better, more interesting choices going forward. But what do you think? Am I just falling victim to idealizing the past? Or do you think the truth lies somewhere in between? Let me know in the comments. I always love to hear from you. Either way, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.